When looking at the world's most popular video game fighting games, several games come to mind. But of course, when it comes to 3D fighters, very few pull on the nostalgic heartstrings as much as Tekken. A franchise that's still going strong to this very day with 7 mainline games and more spin-offs than the competition combined. For better or worse. Welcome everyone to the Complete History Show, a show where we look at some of your favourite video game franchises from yesteryear, and as the title suggests, we're going to be looking at the complete history of the Tekken franchise. So let's get ready for the next battle with Tekken, where we'll be looking at its roots, its history, its inspiration, its development, and of course, every single one of its games. This is Tekken, the complete history. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. The year was 1994. Movies such as Speed, The Usual Suspects, Shawshank Redemption, and Ace Ventura: Pet Detective were blowing up at the box offices, and it seemed that even gaming had hit the big time, with the wildly popular Street Fighter series getting a movie of its own. Regardless of what you think of the outcome of that movie, there was no getting away from the franchise's popularity. Street Fighter was simply big business, originally catching people's attention back in 1987 with the original release, but by the time its sequel came out, there was just no getting away from its immense popularity. Not only was everyone trying to copy this exploding formula, but even Capcom themselves had released not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 official spin-offs to the sequel, and that's not even counting the really obscure spin-offs. Of course, what came next for Capcom was the Alpha series and every crossover that came with that. And as great as these games are, retrospectively, there's no getting away from the mindset of a 90s kid. 2D fighters at the end of the 90s? What we wanted was 3D fighters, because 3D fighters definitely looked better. Apparently. Yep, the legendary Yu Suzuki had already blown people away, as he always did, by releasing Virtua Fighter a year prior. A game that, although still kept the fighting mechanics in a 2D plane, really did shake up the playing field with its super blocky 3D world. And of course, with Street Fighter completely dominating the 2D field, bringing it to the mainstream, and with Virtua Fighter bringing the 3D fighter to the mainstream, every company under the sun wanted a piece of the action, and Namco was no different. Katsuhiro Harada was the guy put in charge of this Virtua Fighter and Street Fighter fighter. A young chap who had always had a fascination with video games. His parents never purchased him his own machine as a youngster, and he was scared about visiting the arcades too often in case he ever got into trouble by his teachers or, of course, his parents. But that didn't stop the fascination. After being dragged out of the ruffian-filled, sweaty arcade centres a few times, he finally got the message. He locked it all away and knuckled down. He got himself a decent position at Waseda University studying psychology, but no matter how hard he tried, there was just no getting away from it. Video games kept calling him. Before you know it, with no parents around to tell him otherwise, Harada's son spent the majority of his free time playing video games. The urge was simply way too strong. It was about this time that he gave up on his studies in order to go down a path of video games, not creating them per se. I mean, he had experimented with this in the past with little to no success, but instead Harada-san wanted to find a job where he could continue playing video games. This led him to a job at an arcade, promoting events and doing marketing, most notably for Street Fighter tournaments. And with his psychology degree behind him, he actually became fascinated in mastering the behaviours of other gamers, working out what drinks kept the players playing longer and what position or location to put the machines in order to get the most amount of playtime, aka the most amount of income from said games. But of course, once he mastered this, he wanted to continue on his working/playing video game path, which is a pretty hard thing to do when you have absolutely no qualifications in the field. But that didn't stop him, as he continued to smash out CVs to every major studio possible in order to move up the video game ladder. I applied to Namco, Sega, Capcom, Taito, Square and many others. I didn't think I really wanted a job with Namco, but they were the first company to offer me a job, so I accepted it. Of course, being a sales rep for Namco wasn't the end goal, and according to an Edge interview, his parents actually broke down in tears when they found out that this was the path he had taken. Thankfully, after a year of smashing sales, record-breaking first-year sales I might add, he had finally got the approval of his video game-hating parents and, more importantly, the higher-ups at the company. So much so that he got himself another job joining a new team in game development. The group had not long finished up on the game Knuckleheads, yet again a rather forgettable, mostly 2D arcade beat-em-up that hadn't done all that well, further proving to the company that the time to move on was now. 3D graphics, polygons and motion capture was the future of gaming, a future that everybody agreed on. The problem was that nobody was really any good at actually doing it. You see, at the beginning of Tekken's life, the game was nothing. It wasn't even a game, it was a small team at Namco trying to understand this new style of gameplay, testing out how to create 3D models and, more importantly, actually implementing those models into some kind of video game. A fighting game was the obvious choice for the test case, especially considering the team had just finished up with that Knuckleheads game, and on top of that, several members had just directly moved from working on Virtua Fighter at Sega and were now working on this. On top of that, they had the well-respected Namco employee Yanaka Kanoi, who would eventually go on to work on the previously mentioned Point Blank series. Anyway, the game was progressing along at a snail's pace. Virtua Fighter was blowing arcade goers away on Sega's own Model 1 arcade unit, and the sequel, which would soon be released, was going to use the even more powerful Model 2 unit that cost Sega $2 million, that's $3.5 million by today's standards, in order to simply just get the chips needed to develop it. In other words, Namco was in trouble. In order to compete with Sega, the initial idea was to release the competitor on Namco's System 22 arcade board, released a few years prior, that was most well known for Ridge Racer. But if they did this, not only would they be releasing a game that is obviously not as powerful as Virtua Fighter, but it would still be incredibly expensive. Thankfully for them, they had a close working relationship with Sony. Namco's managing director Shigeshi Nakamura had been working with Sony's top dog Ken Kutaragi on their move into the video game console space. Of course, they already had got their toes wet working in the 16-bit generation, but after the fallout with Nintendo on the never-released Nintendo PlayStation and the unwillingness of Sega's Japan leg to create a Sega/Sony console, Sony ended up working with Namco to create an arcade board that used the best parts of the System 22 but made it cheaper and easier to port for the upcoming Sony PlayStation. What they essentially just created was a beefed up version of the PlayStation hardware in an arcade unit. In other words, they were bringing the arcade experience home once again.
PlayStation 3D 格闘ゲーム Namco
Tekken would eventually be released on the 9th of December 1994 in Japan arcades, and almost a year later on the Sony PlayStation, where on Western shores it almost got a name change to Rave War. Looking back in those early days, it's hard to envision a world where Tekken, a brand new franchise, could ever take on the already established and far better looking Virtua Fighter 2, considering that machine was released a month earlier. Sure, the game was fun, and some would argue that it's actually better, but this was the arcades. Who in their right mind would choose these clunky graphics over the super slick Sega offering? Well, the answer is simple. It was cheaper. Sega's arcade game was definitely better looking, but Namco's was significantly cheaper. I personally remember not really seeing Sega's arcade game too much, maybe once or twice, but Tekken, that was a mainstay at every single bowling alley I ever visited. To the average onlooker, it was another 3D fighter, but it had some important changes that made it incredibly unique, and everyone that ever played these games would instantly recognize that. Virtua Fighter was continuing on with the pretty standard 3-button layout. You've got a guard button, a punch button, and a kick button. It worked in the arcades, and it was perfect for the Saturn controller layout. Tekken, however, was different, as it needed yet another button to use and gave the player the ability to control each individual limb rather than a standard attack. The hardcore but smaller fighting crowd definitely lent towards Virtua Fighter 2 more in this instance. However, Tekken was definitely more appealing to the average arcade goer. Still, it did offer some kind of decent fighting technique for those hardcore crowd to at least get to grips with. Understanding the speed and movements of each of the game's limited characters with these controls gave players new ways to chain certain attacks together. Of course, with this being a first game in the series, it's not exactly easy to go back and play, and it's far from leveled, with certain moves being completely unblockable, but still, for the time, it was revolutionary, and the DNA of what would eventually become is without a doubt found in the depths of this overly basic game. When looking back at interviews with the core team, it's easy to see why this was so basic. Not only had they brought in a guy that had never properly worked on a game before to balance it, and not only was the majority of the team completely new to this 3D world, but the most important part to take from this history is that it was simply a test. A test to prove to themselves that they could do it. A 3D character that would respond to your inputs. The gameplay, that was a bit of an afterthought, but still, it turned out pretty well for the time. TEKKEN. In fact, because this was such a new style of game, a lot of the fundamentals gameplay-wise were made up on the fly, where practically every single commercially successful game that you can probably think of was made with a design document from the get-go. Tekken had inter-developer freedom, which was essentially a make-it-up-as-you-go-along affair. If you think you've got a cool idea for the game, sure, chuck it in. If you think that idea that your colleague just added was stupid, then delete it. Of course, this caused some serious tension with developers doing what they could to prove that they had that winning formula to beat Sega. And as sloppy as this sounds, it did thankfully provide the top dogs with plenty of options to weed through in order to make this game unique, albeit with some serious hair loss to go along with it. Because of this, he formed a team of the most dedicated Namco staff that would work under him, waking up early and testing out every little thing that they could with each character, and doing so until the sun went down, then testing more before passing out from exhaustion on lined up chairs in the office because the floor was too cold. The end result was a hardcore amount of sleep deprivation, fine-tuning and creating a rather strange game that arcade goers would really get to grips with, as well as PlayStation owners too. Robots against ninjas, martial artists against bears, sumo wrestlers against devils, and secret agents against the world's worst parents. Yeah, that's Hayashi, the bad guy who chucked his kid off the side of a cliff to see if he would survive. If he does, then and only then would he be eligible enough to take over the family business. Oh, no Daddy's Day card for you. Strange doesn't even begin to explain the crazy storyline behind these games. And in fact, what I just told you actually ends up getting changed later on in the series, so dig deep if you really want to. What Namco just released may have been agonising for the developers and playtesters, but for us early game players, it really was quite impressive, and it felt great too, for the time. Sure, they may have fibbed a little saying that the characters were motion controlled when really the technology to hand was so primitive that they only really captured limb movements, and even that had to be reanimated frame by frame in practically every single instance, but it didn't matter. Everything within the world of Sega vs Namco had just gone crazy. Daytona beat Ridge Racer with its 60 frames per second, and Tekken just did the same thing when going up against the original Virtua Fighter. Plus, this new style of gameplay and bat crap crazy character lineup made this game far more accessible to the average onlooker. It was stupid, and it was fun. Sure, the competitive fighting scene would most definitely lean more towards Sega's offering, especially with Virtua Fighter 2, which is an all-round much better game, but for the average Joe, Tekken was winning the battle. Thankfully, this new 4-button controlling your limbs layout style that changes up the formula more than you may think, which we will get to in more detail soon, as basic as it was, did birth many other 3D fighters that pushed the controls even further into the hardcore realm of competitive fighting. But again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, because next up we have Tekken 2.
If you're looking for the greatest fighters on Earth, this is where you'll find them. Tekken 2, powered by Namco. 前作をしのぐシリーズ最新作、鉄拳2登場。PlayStation.
Released less than a year later in Japanese arcades and roughly a year later on the PlayStation, depending on where you lived, this title managed to bring in quite a few of those ideas that the team wanted to implement in the earlier game that was either voted against or simply deleted by a disgruntled team member. Oh, and in case you were wondering, yes, that same make it up as you go along approach was present here too. Heck, if it worked for the first game being the first ever PlayStation game to sell 1 million units, why not do it again? This mentality resulted in Takemura, the original designer of Yoshimitsu, reviving a character that was left on the cutting room floor the first time around. Unfortunately for her, she ended up leaving during the development, and that's why you can't play as a giant penguin in the sequel. No, seriously. And before you call that stupid, let me remind you that one of the developers actually made another stupid character at home in his spare time to show to his colleagues who loved it so much that they all rallied together, and that's why you got a fighting kangaroo now within the world of Tekken. Thankfully, some genuinely great additions also got implemented with the characters, comprising of around 800 polygons each, and taking between 3 days and a week to model each character, which obviously doesn't sound like much nowadays, but back in the day, this was a big deal. The ability to roll in and out of the background rather than just towards or away from your opponent also helped further push this into a true 3D fighter. The game was less stiff, the movements felt fluid, chaining those combos was a lot more accessible here too. You could grab your opponents from all angles. If you was good enough, you could even perform a Tekken move that would get you out of being grabbed, and although it's obviously not as fluid as Tekken 3, it's head and shoulders above what came before it. No longer do you have simply arcade or versus, but now you have practice, you have trial, team battles, time attack. That PlayStation version had unique CGI endings, a remix soundtrack. It truly was everything that fans of the series wanted from a sequel. A lot of the sillier ideas ended up getting implemented into this game if you knew how to unlock them, but thankfully the comic style speech bubbles that would pop up and say stuff like "ouch" did not. Thankfully. Yet again, the game became a huge seller for the PlayStation, and the magazine Maximum actually went to visit the studio whilst this game was in development, and they reported on Tekken 3 already being in development. Provisional title.
I didn't think our marriage would survive.
It was really awful. Both of us kept everything pent up until one of us would just explode.
Hey, stupid! What kind of a meal was that? You are the...
Then we discovered Tekken 3. This is for 40 years of macaroni and cheese.
That's for never saying I'm sorry.
And this is for your mother.
That's for the loser that you are, Patrick. Thank you, Tekken 3. PlayStation.
Obviously that was what it was called, and here it is, in my opinion, the best Tekken game ever released, because it's the one that I played the most. Tekken was an already established franchise by this point. Sony's PlayStation was winning the console wars at the time, and because of that, more people knew what Tekken was. It was a fun game that anyone could pick up and play with little to no skill levels in fighting games. However, it had started, more so with number 2, becoming something that competitive gamers were really enjoying. In short, if Street Fighter was the go-to 2D fighter, Tekken was becoming the go-to 3D fighter, for the majority at least. As stated, one of the reasons it had done so well and captured the attention of all gamers, no matter your skill level, was because of its Virtua Fighter roots. Seiichi Ishii was the designer and director of these first 2 games, but after the release of the, yet again, million-unit shipping sequel, he left the company and created Dream Factory, who went on to create titles such as Tobal 1 and 2 and the awesome but never forgotten The Bouncer. Actually, you know what? It's been a long time since I've played this. I'm a little scared about playing it again because my guess is that it's aged rather badly. Anyway, with Ishii-san out of the picture, Tekken 3 needed a new guy completely in charge, and that person would be Katsuhiro Harada. You remember him, the guy whose parents kicked off that he wouldn't get off his arse out of those arcades. Well, he's back again, and this time he's in charge, and for anyone that's ever played the third entry, you will understand why this guy in particular is so important to the franchise. Tekken was loved by pretty much everyone, that budget fighter that was hard to hate on the most successful system of the time. But now, with its hardcore fan base behind it, why wouldn't Namco push and make this third and final entry for the system a premium product? The first big step was that Tekken 3 was created on the newly designed Namco System 12 arcade board, which was essentially a beefed up System 11 board, PlayStation's original hardware, but on speed. The character model's limbs were no longer separate from the torso, but instead became a single polygon filled character, and finally motion capture was implemented correctly this time, in order to create the smoothest characters that the series had seen so far. But of course, they still took some serious liberties here. Pro wrestlers came in to clean up King's movements. Hwoarang Su did a fantastic job bringing newcomer Hwoarang to life, but without a doubt the most notable use of motion capture done right was when they brought in Marcel Pereira. Marcel was a capoeira instructor, and a very good one at that. A blend of martial arts, dance, self-defense, gymnastics and music. He had just done a seminar on the sport, and unknowingly to him, Namco was in attendance and decided to bring him in to capture the unique fighting style for the game, and the result was Eddie Gordo, easily Tekken's most successful character and without a doubt the most hippity-hoppity of the bunch. Now, to be fair, the end result wasn't exactly to Marcel's taste. He only ended up giving it about a 6 out of 10 because it didn't represent the sport very well. The clothes were wrong, the naming of the character was wrong, and the naming of the character's moves were also wrong. On top of that, the fact that this new style of expression was used 100% for fighting worried Marcel, as the sport had so much more to offer than that. I mean, let's be honest, when have you ever seen a bar fight turn into a smooth breakdance beat 'em up? Almost never, right? Regardless, this new style, along with the new graphics, improved roster, sound, and well, everything else pleased everyone. And I do mean everyone. Characters like Eddie not only attracted newcomers, but they were brilliant to just pick up and play. And on top of that, it was the smoother sidestepping of all characters that really grabbed the attention of the hardcore gamer. This was a maneuver that wasn't exactly unfamiliar in other 3D fighting games, but here, in Tekken, it completely changed up the way pro players would interact with each other, even more so than in Tekken 2, and this with the quickly discovered dash moves that only the hardcore gamers of the world knew how to pull off, and further additions in the balancing and countering of all players, and you've got a game that is literally going to please everyone. Even those gamers that wanted stupid characters, because let me tell you, this game had them. Slinging a couple of fun modes like Tekken Ball, which is essentially Tekken meets volleyball, originally designed to teach players how to air juggle their opponents, and Tekken Force, which is a pretty much bare bones beat 'em up style game that I was obsessed with back then, primarily because I love that series and hadn't played a memorable game in the genre since my Mega Drive days, until I played the Bouncer, of course. I think Tekken 3 wasn't just a slightly better game than 2, it was a groundbreaking turn for the series. The new management and the team as a whole wanted to give PlayStation owners the best fighter that they could. Virtua Fighter was for the most part still dominating the arcades in Japan, but in the world of home consoles, Tekken reigned supreme. It's hard to find a fighting game, even to this day, that packed in quite as much as this one did. If you wasn't a fan up to this point, you were now. To many, including several team members themselves, the new graphics, music, and heck even the killing off of a huge roster of fan favourite characters in place of new ones didn't make this the third game in the series. Tekken 3 was the beginning, a game that wasn't just Namco's attempt at 3D fighting, it was a dominant series that the competition, including Namco themselves, desperately tried to replicate. After the release of Tekken 3, the franchise was firmly established as a franchise that was going to be milked dry. And let me tell you guys, within the world of Tekken, that's nothing but a good thing. For the most part. Because up next, Tekken went to another system for the first ever time. And no, I'm not talking about the PlayStation 2. Yet. Tekken Card Challenge came out on the Wonder Swan back in 1999. In this title, you play as several characters from the third game, wandering around a fog-filled world, reveal said world as you explore, looking for the exit and going up against several foes as you progress. As the name suggests, this is done very simply in a card-style fighting match rather than a more fisticuff style that you're no doubt more used to. Essentially, it's top trumps. Your number, which is selected by a spinning dial, shows one of your 4 cards, and if that card has a bigger number than your opponent's card, congrats, you can continue exploring. The feedback was pretty harsh, probably because people wanted another Tekken, right? Well, come on, set your expectations. It's not that great of a fighting game, obviously, but as a card game, I don't know, it's pretty average, I suppose. Thankfully, the world didn't have to wait too long for a true sequel to be released, and my god, was it awesome.
Master, am I not the greatest fighter in the world?
Your kung fu is strong, Pond Skipper, but the Tekken fighters are stronger.
What?
Heihachi is a thundering storm. Xiao Yu rides the wings of the crane. Nina strikes like the snake. And Yoshimitsu's sword cuts the wind.
I will defeat the Tekken fighters.
Tekken Tag Tournament, rated T for teen.
Tekken Tag Tournament yet again took what made the previous proper games so popular and essentially smashed it together into arguably the ultimate greatest hits for the series, up to this point. On top of that, the game refined more of those controls, balancing a few of the characters for the hardcore community, and as the name suggests, they added the almighty tag gameplay mechanic. Now you can link together some of your favourite characters and switch between them on the fly. And you can do all of this using the new PlayStation 2. Tekken had never looked so good. Sure, the arcade release of 3 had beautiful backgrounds, but in order to get that working on the OG PlayStation, they had to go back to having a panorama static image. Well, that's no longer the case. The game looks stunning and it plays just like the last game. Now, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to shoehorn a little bit of a personal history into this segment. Tekken Tag Tournament meant the world to me on a personal level. It was around about the time that my parents were going through a very messy breakup, and to make matters worse, the pub that I was living in at the time with my parents literally kicked us out on the streets with absolutely no warning, not giving us back any of our possessions until some crappy thing was sorted out between the parents and the landlord owner, which I won't get into here. Regardless, this forced us to quickly move into our own rented property with practically nothing to our name for a month or so, besides my binders of music, which I would use to DJ and would literally carry around with me everywhere, add a few clothes and not much else. If you're picturing Chandler and Joey in the living room with garden furniture eating takeaways, you're pretty spot on with what our house looked like at the time.
Could we be more white trash?
It was a tough couple of weeks. Garden furniture in the living room and some old telly that we'd found from somewhere sitting on a load of old cardboard boxes in the living room. It was indeed a struggle, but we made do with what we had. And then, all of a sudden, we got a phone call. Your PlayStation 2 pre-order is ready to be collected with SSX and Tekken Tag Tournament. Both of these games helped bring us together as a family during a really hard point in our life. We didn't have much, including memory cards I might add, but we did have each other, and in a weird sort of way, looking back, it was Tekken Tag Tournament that was the glue, and I will always hold TTT close to my heart for not only being a good game, but for being such an important part of my life. Anyway, back to the history. TTT was and still is utterly fantastic. Of course, with this being a bit of a mashup, it came with its fair share of unbalanced characters that are essentially a bit stupid and unfair to play, that is if you knew who to choose. However, as this was a spin-off title to the main game, this unfair playing field actually helped with the title's obscure nature. The cinematic opening with the incredible music will always be cemented into my brain, and although I must admit that I was very disappointed with the majority of the characters not getting their own CGI cutscenes, the game itself was just way too good to ignore. Fans of the series like this game so much, in fact, that an HD remaster was released as part of the Tekken Hybrid many years later. However, for fans wanting a true sequel in the mainline Tekken franchise, you wouldn't have to wait too long, because in 2001, we got Tekken 4.
Silence! I hope you slept well, because now you die. You have grown strong, Egg. Prepare to meet Iron Skillet.
Oh yeah, Tekken 4 is here. Punish your enemies with new moves, interactive environments, and new fighters. It's a legend so deep, no one just plays it, they live it. Tekken 4, rated T for teen.
The game brought with it a far more hardcore fighting style with yet more refined controls, counters and maneuverability. Most notably, the sidewalk rather than the sidestep. The graphics look noticeably better with the spinning backgrounds essentially disappearing completely in place of full 3D environments that you can actually collide with and in some cases interact with. Along with the changes in characters' movesets, Tekken 4 did what it always set out to do, and that was to please everyone no matter how much of a hardcore gamer you was. If this was your first time playing, then you're gonna have a good time, and the mashing of those buttons will actually result in something happening on the screen. But for the hardcore gamer, the new additions, as small as they seem, really did push the possibilities of how a game like this can be tackled. You see, when a 2D fighting game has a punch, a kick and a guard, it technically doesn't matter what side of the screen you're on. You're looking at a mirror image of the same image. When you give each of your 4 limbs a button in a 3D space, then it becomes more complicated. And as the series moves on, players started using this to their advantages and obviously their opponents' disadvantages. Think about it like this: the player on the left's right arm is actually further away from the opponent than the right player's right arm. In the original games, it really didn't matter too much, but as the series turned into a more competitive fighter, rather than being a simple showstopper, things like this became important, and the developers constantly messed around with this new fighting mechanic in order to further complicate it, and it was Tekken 4 that really did mix it up. Again, to the average gamer that was just having a laugh with a few friends and a few beers, it didn't matter, but to the hardcore crowd, it did matter. Good or bad, you were going to be having a good time with this game nowadays. But back then, this game wasn't exactly loved. The crowd was incredibly split on this title, and the reason for this isn't all that easy to pin down. In previous games, it's all about you versus someone else, doing it as fast as you can, chaining combos together in later games, and doing it with a more refined gameplay style. The silly characters of number 3, adding even more crazy mechanics, and of course the crazy big roster of characters in Tekken Tag Tournament. 4, on the other hand, slowed down the speed a little, which forced you to get up close and personal more often. The music seemed quite chilled in comparison to the up-rocking tunes of the previous entries, and the roster, honestly, it did leave a little to be desired. Plus, as sexy as the motion comic style cinematics were, many fans, including myself, wanted more CGI filled endings, like the perfect for the time Tekken 3. In a nutshell, from what I can tell, it just wasn't the big leap that Tekken 2, Tekken 3 or Tekken Tag Tournament was. It did bring a few extras, and those few extras really did separate the crowd. Again, if you was a casual gamer, it didn't matter, but to those hardcore gamers, not so much. Thankfully, retrospectively, people have gone back to Tekken 4 and seen it for what it was, a really good, interesting, experimental release in the Tekken franchise. Tekken Advance, however, well, that's a different story. Tekken was all about taking 2D and keeping it 3D, and obviously this was going the other way around, and the end result is actually, well, it's actually super impressive. Expect this bad boy to turn up on a Stop Skeletons video one day, because although the game itself is obviously 2D, going for that same Donkey Kong Country pre-rendered sprite-styled look, the gameplay is mostly intact, and they did it with a 2-button system. Of course, playing a game like this is virtually pointless in this day and age, but credit where credit is due, until the PSP came about, Tekken Advance was a more than adequate way to play Tekken on the go, if you was the average Tekken consumer. Pro players? I wouldn't bother. Not only did you get Tekken 4 the same year in 2001, but 3 years later, you got Tekken 5.
You guys are gonna like this one.
has what it takes to be the king of the Iron Fist tournament. Tekken is back with the best graphics, craziest combos, most playable characters, and most modes in franchise history. Tekken 5, rated T for teen.
Whilst those hardcore Tekken fans continued to fight over the questionable design choices found in Tekken 4, the less questionable Tekken Tag Tournament continued to rise in popularity. Namco knew that they had to bring back the old fans, taking away the seriousness that was Tekken 4, and in true Tekken fashion, they went dinosaur fart crazy. The roster, the stories, the music, and more importantly, the gameplay felt more Tekken than it ever did before. The game was created using a brand new engine for the series and was the final entry to have much of any arcade presence outside of Japan. That original game was created on Namco's 256 board, which as stated didn't see much love outside of Japan besides this game and Time Crisis 4, in case you was wondering. Less gritty realism is what they wanted, and vibrant fighting worlds were the order of the day here. Yes, it was a little bit stupid, but it was great. Tekken 5 was a complete showstopper even on the less powerful PlayStation 2 hardware. It was attractive, it was fast, it was still a little unbalanced to be fair, but just like all previous entries, it attracted gamers from casual to hardcore and was great fun no matter what step of the ladder you perched on. To fix the balancing issues as well as a few cosmetic changes, the arcades got an update known as Tekken 5.1 or Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection, which us home console gamers got on the PSP and eventually as a downloadable title for the PlayStation 3. Full 60 frames per second gameplay on a handheld, this was something truly to behold, and heck, the PlayStation 3 version was obviously even better looking. To many, this was the ultimate Tekken experience. Nothing else came close, well, besides 7, but again, that depends on who you're talking to. Yet again, you got more balancing, more modes, more characters. It is without a doubt the most intense Tekken to date. When you start getting down to the nitty gritty of how many frames certain moves take, this is essentially the turbo of the series. Without a doubt, it was the most competitive, and even on the PSP, which obviously came out first, it looked great, and more importantly, controlled great. Especially if you got the Japanese or American version of the PSP game that actually came with a D-pad overlay that would actually help the player use the system's rather small buttons with ease. Now, I've personally never got the chance to actually try these out because for whatever reason they weren't included in the release in England, but hey, apparently they're good. Both versions ended up becoming found on numerous top 20 lists for both systems. Not bad for a download-only title for the PlayStation 3, am I right? And even though it took some serious time to make it onto the platform, it was 2006 by this point. Hype was already welling up for the next entry in the series, Tekken 6. However, between the release of Tekken 5 and its ports, we only gone and got ourselves 2 official spin-offs, didn't we? Kind of. Namco Cross Capcom was the first major title that the two companies collaborated on, and well, it wasn't really Tekken, was it? It featured a whole heap of characters from both companies' back catalogues in a sort of confusing action RPG game, and of course you got some Tekken characters thrown into the mix because of this. In its country of origin, the title was beloved, surprisingly not due to the RPG mechanics that would actually become quite tedious the more you played it, but more so for the stories. Fans loved seeing these characters that they knew and loved interacting with rival companies' beloved mascots, and even though it was a little too niche to ever get a Western release, the game started a chain reaction of crossover titles that we will soon venture back to a little bit later on in the video. Because the other game that was found between Tekken 5 and Dark Resurrection was a game called Death by Degrees, without a doubt the weirdest spin-off in the entire Tekken franchise. Now, fighting games moving into different genres isn't exactly a new thing. We already discussed the card-based Wonder Swan game and the RPG, but this is what happens when you try and turn it into an action-adventure title. Originally known as simply Nina, because that's the only character you get to play as, this obscurity doesn't play nor does it look anything to do with the Tekken franchise. Heck, when Mortal Kombat did the same thing, there was at least no mistaking that this was from the Mortal Kombat universe. You got that big iconic logo, it even says the words Mortal Kombat in a decent enough font size too, but here, sure, it says Tekken 2, only really noticeable if you plant your face right up against the box, but the character herself, considering she changes her appearance several times over the course of this series without being too harsh, Nina looks no different than the majority of blonde-haired CGI girls that were included for no other reason than to prove that sex sells. There's nothing that stands out here. If you was a passerby in 2005, the same year that the 360 was released, my guess is that you would have just picked it up and put it straight back down before moving on. Which is what most people did. The game did not sell well at all. It was ambitious, I will give it that. Heck, even the story, if you're after that sort of thing, is actually quite good for this sort of game. But not only did it not look like Tekken, it didn't play like Tekken either. The reason they called it Death by Degrees, other than linking to the story slightly, was because the moves performed by Nina were controlled by using the right analog stick. Now, I suppose the idea works in a 3D space with each room flipping cameras, similar to how Resident Evil games work. However, when you suddenly change the screen, using a directional method isn't the best way to go, as those directions obviously change direction. It is without a doubt the game's biggest flaw. Thankfully, you do kind of begrudgingly get used to it eventually. It just always feels like a chore to play. If I'm honest, I actually quite like that this game exists because it's a nice spin-off into a franchise which is primarily just fighting games. It just needed a little bit longer in development to really make it the great game that it wants to be. There is a great game hidden beneath here, which unfortunately obviously they couldn't do in 2005. Worth checking out if you run out of Devil May Cry and Resident Evil games, I suppose. Just don't expect anything to do with Tekken here. Right, let's get back to the mainline games, shall we? Whilst Dark Resurrection was still in development, Tekken 6 was also in development. The first true game to be made for the next-gen series of consoles. The first mainline game to branch away from being a Sony exclusive. Apparently due to fan requests, and finally the first to be made in the arcades on the new System 357 arcade board. Now, according to Namco themselves, the response to that arcade original was higher than it had ever been for any Tekken game in the franchise. But when fans saw that first trailer, they weren't sold. Thankfully, by the time the game was released on home consoles, it had so much extra padding that it was pretty hard to not like it. A huge roster of characters with a crazy amount of customizations, online gameplay and plenty of modes to boot. The end result is a game that continued to please casual gamers but started to not do so well with the hardcore scene. You see, the big problem with Tekken 6, besides its loading...
Get ready for the next battle.
It is an incredibly unbalanced game, more so than any other game in the franchise to date. Not only has the Tekken team got a whole heap of characters to try and level out, but you also have a rage-like meter that will increase your character's ability the lower your health gets, making you, the worst player, more powerful again. Casual gamers may not mind this, but veterans found more flaws than ever with this new gameplay style. The story mode, which was essentially a 3D Streets of Rage-like game, really didn't feel all that good either. No matter your skill level, unfortunately you would actually need to play through this mode in order to win any decent amount of in-game currency that you would then use to customize your character and stand out as unique during those online matches. Matches that, at least at the time, were reportedly pretty damn buggy and would quite often kick you out of the game. It may sound like I'm raging on Tekken 6, but that's not the case. In fact, I do remember when it came out spending quite a lot of time on this title because I was just enjoying it for what it was.
Rated T for teen.
It's only when you go back and play it alongside what came after it, or even before it in some instances, that you realise that even though it looks very pretty, it really is quite forgettable when compared to its other entries. Which sadly can also be said for Tekken Tag Tournament 2. Talk about an unbalanced mess. Even more characters are in this game, and although that may sound impressive due to the sheer quantity on offer here, some of the characters are almost the same as other characters, just with a changed skin. Learn how to play that one character to the best of their ability, and essentially what you have is a juggling mess of the same character with 2 health bars. Of course, it had its fans, like all entries did, especially those of the Nintendo variety who got to play the game on the brand spanking new Wii U in its exclusive version. I had this one too, I've got to admit. Upon release, I enjoyed it. And you know what? You guys probably did too. Looking back, the majority of review sites did, getting mostly favourable reviews for the time. They praised the 720 gameplay, the huge roster and always relevant pick up and play style of the game. But they also mentioned the higher than normal barrier that was needed to truly master a game like this, and looking back, this was probably why it sold so badly. The game was a massive flop, financially being the worst selling game in the mainline franchise so far, and although you may have enjoyed it, the hardcore fighting scene for the most part did not, and that hard to learn tagging mechanic did push away more than it pulled in. Tekken was quickly becoming a series that wasn't for everyone. Sure, perhaps the casual gamer that hadn't played a Tekken game since maybe PlayStation 1 gave it a go, and the hardcore Tekken fanboy would obviously pick it up, but besides that, the hardcore community wasn't a fan, and the average casual consumer had moved on as well. Thankfully, if you was a hardcore fan, you had plenty to consume. The game was released early in demo form on the previously mentioned Tekken Hybrid that featured an HD remake of the original and a demo version of Tag 2. But on top of that, you also got a 3D version of the Tekken movie Blood Vengeance. Right, ready to go crazy because Blood Vengeance is just one of 4 Tekken movies. Let's go. The first movie came out in 1998 and was a Japan animation title that's perfectly 90s anime. Not good 90s anime, but instead completely forgettable. Terrible fight scenes, the majority of the characters are not in it, it's horrifically dubbed, yes it's kind of enjoyable, mainly because of all the reasons I just mentioned. And next up we have the live action flick, released in 2009, and goddamn did it bomb, with a $30 million budget and only gaining back $1.7 million and a Rotten Tomatoes score of 0. Now to be fair, that is a little harsh. Sure, the movie is super cliche and the story is super forgettable, but honestly it's better than you think. Of course, it's far from the best one-on-one video game fighter adaptation that goes to the Mortal Kombat original and the remake, along with the Street Fighter movie and Street Fighter 2 anime. But Tekken, I gotta say that I personally didn't mind the film. Sure, if it wasn't for that Tekken name, it would be completely forgettable, but hey, it does have the Tekken name, so whatever. It takes more than a few liberties with the franchise, which isn't necessarily a bad thing when you think about it. But for a mostly direct-to-video film, I generally do not mind it. Good enough fight scenes, mostly recognisable characters, and a forgettable story. Grab some beers and you'll no doubt have a good enough time with this one, just like I did. The next film was the one found on Tekken Hybrid, Blood Vengeance, and what you essentially have here is a response movie to the live-action flick's terrible feedback, made by the same company that made the most recent game's cutscenes, and most importantly being way more true to the original storyline. Take that however you want to take it, because in all honesty it's good enough for what it is, as long as you have plenty of beers, because just like the games, it's stupidity at its finest. And that finally leaves us with Tekken 2, a prequel to the original live-action flick that honestly was more of what I was expecting with that original flick. My god, is this film bad? Originally envisioned to be part of a whole new franchise of Tekken films. If you took out all of the lost-like flash-forward found in the movie though, you would have absolutely no idea that this ever was a Tekken movie. Hey, maybe it's why I really don't mind the original too much after watching the sequel. I don't know, because even though that film had some serious issues storyline-wise, it was at least still a recognisable Tekken movie. This, Not a chance. Honestly, I doubt that anybody that's watched those first 3 Tekken movies are thinking to themselves, oh, I really hope they make a prequel. Look, if you guys just want some more Tekken cutscenes, go and watch the Tekken cutscenes instead. Definitely better than that 4th film. Anyway, back to Tekken Tag Tournament 2. Tag 2 did bad, like really bad. The franchise was hurting, it was bleeding money, and unfortunately there really is only one thing you can do to fix that in this day and age, right? If you're thinking about making a comeback, yeah, that actually did happen. But before then you had Tekken Revolution, a free-to-play Tekken game. And by the way, this is not to be confused with the confusingly named Tekken, which was another free-to-play game for mobiles, which actually doesn't play all that badly considering it's a mobile game, requiring you to swipe and tap instead of clicking buttons, waiting for your special moves to replenish on the bottom right before you can tap them and execute. Like I said, it's really not terrible, things considered. They probably did the best they could with what they had, just don't expect wonders here. Anyway, back to Tekken Revolution. A game full of mostly reused Tag 2 assets, and a game that actually, on paper, it works. Sure, most people associate the series with home consoles, but its roots were in the arcade. When you booted it up, you were given a couple of virtual coins, you would drop them in a virtual slot, and that let you play a couple of matches. Once the coins were gone, you would have to wait a set amount of time, and the coins would replenish. Of course, you didn't need to wait if you put your own money in, just like Candy Crush. The game was stripped back to its core, it was a simple one-on-one fighter, and to be fair, it did offer you a lot considering it was a free-to-play game. I mean, that makes sense, they had all of the assets ready to hand from Tekken Tag Tournament 2, right? Exactly, and along with some balancing of those Tag 2 characters and the obvious removal of the tag feature itself, the game did of course feature something new. Why wouldn't it? And that feature was the invincibility move. Now you may have heard me say this 1,000 times already, but for newbies and button mashers, that's not all that bad. But annoyingly, the invincibility move was literally what it said on the tin. 99% of the time you couldn't counter it, meaning that you were going to be going down if it was used against you. And just like all previously questionable titles in the franchise, this new feature took us 1 step forward and 2 steps back, because sadly, what you actually have here is actually a really good idea for a free-to-play game. Along with the ability to boost your character's power to 200, which also completely broke the game, it also included bloody RPG mechanics, because apparently every Japanese game eventually needs to include them, resulting in randomized hits offering critical attacks at random, which is completely stupid for a competitive fighter. Now, to be honest with you guys, I'm doing this part of the history based on others' reviews. I did play it briefly myself back in the day, and besides quite a few dropped matches, I didn't see too many issues myself, but sadly I can't go back and play this anymore because, as you would expect, it's no longer available. However, please do keep in mind, as much as the hardcore community found ways to complain and break this game, it was still fairly well reviewed by the average consumer, and a lot of what was found in these more recent titles did in fact pave their way for the true return that all fans, hardcore or casual, would enjoy. But before then, Tekken 3D Prime Edition was a pretty decent looking Tekken game that kept its 60 frames per second gameplay even with the 3D on, and was actually one of the better looking games for the system early on. As a quick one-on-one fighter, it's actually really not that bad at all. As a full game, it's very much lacking. Only worth getting if you're a hardcore fan or a 3DS collector, as this always seems to be quite cheap. Random Tekken characters found their way into Namco's Anna Kournikovas Smash Court Tennis. Full Boko Heroes X was a mobile RPG that featured several Tekken characters too. Galaga Tekken Edition was a thing that actually existed and was released on the 20th anniversary of the first game, where old school players would remember you actually got to play a mini version of Galaga whilst the first game was loading, and if you completed the game without missing a single enemy, you would unlock a special character. And therefore this new mobile game that may seem a little bit pointless actually is a nice little history piece. The previously mentioned Pac-Man Fever was a terrible Mario Party clone that of course featured Pac-Man, a whole heap of deformed characters from within the world of Namco, alongside, of course, Tekken characters. You had Tekken characters playable in the often overlooked Smash ripoff PlayStation All-Star Battle Royale. A couple of characters from the world of Tekken found their way into Point Blank 3, again previously mentioned on the Complete History show, nudge nudge. Pokken Tournament is definitely worth at least mentioning, as it was made by the same company and shares a lot of its mechanics, and its name is quite literally a blend of Pokemon and Tekken. Just like all previous Tekken games, this one is surprisingly fun no matter your skill level, and has a decent amount of depth to what many would consider a pretty bare bones game. Pro Baseball for Mr. 2011 is one of quite possibly thousands of Japanese baseball games, and this one features some Tekken characters, apparently. Project Cross Zone is a follow-up to the previously mentioned Namco Cross Capcom game, although this one is even better because it features Sega characters too, as does its sequel Project Cross Zone 2. Smash Court Tennis Pro Tournament 2 featured a few characters from the series. Of course, the world's greatest roster ever to be found in gaming also featured a Tekken character, as Kazuya gets ready for the next battle in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Tekken Arena is a completely forgotten Tekken MMORPG that I had no idea existed, yet here it is. A game where you earn in-game currency by flicking a static image of your character towards a static image of another character. This game honestly has less to do with Tekken than the Wonder Swan card challenge game, if you ask me. Which actually did kind of get a sequel on mobile phones with Tekken Card Tournament, that yet again lets you choose your cards, aka your moves, before watching the world's slowest Tekken match unfold in front of your eyes. Tekken Command Battle and its sequel, Tekken Command Battle 2, tries to do what Typing of the Dead did by getting you to type commands faster than your opponent in order to win a game. What was surprisingly cool for the sequel was a mode called Tekken Radar that would use your phone's GPS system and let you know if passers-by also had the game, and therefore allow you to duke it out on the streets. You have no less than 9 Tekken pachinko machines that we all like to moan about, yet look utterly dazzling to me personally. Tekken Resolute is a surprisingly well done Java mobile Tekken game. Of course, it's extremely hard to play, but the sprite work and ability to play via Bluetooth made this a Java favourite for the time. Urban Reign was a strange mix of PlayStation 2 era wrestling games and a 3D beat-em-up brawler style package that of course featured some Tekken characters. Weirdly, the PlayStation 1 game Xevious 3DG was a polygon heavy top-down shooter that again featured Tekken characters. And finally, you've got Street Fighter Cross Tekken and Tekken Cross Street Fighter. Yes, they are 2 different games. Right, okay. With Street Fighter 4 completely reviving the one-on-one fighting scene more than any other to that magnitude, this boosted several other companies to do the same thing, including Capcom themselves, and Street Fighter Cross Tekken was eventually announced. Boy oh boy was this a confusing mashup. Both games had their fans, but as stated in the video already, they played incredibly differently to one another. The marketing was obvious. 2 of the biggest video game fighting franchises duking it out in the same game. However, speculation definitely started setting in when people saw the first reveal. Especially when another game called Tekken Cross Street Fighter was also said to be in the works, this time from Namco, which again had the fan base excited but dumbfounded at the same time. For those into the fighting scene, this was really obscure. I suppose for people outside of the fighting scene, the best way I can describe it is if someone like, I don't know, Sega released some kind of Sonic the Hedgehog racing game up against Mario. It would be completely stupid. But anyway, regardless of the confusion, the hype was real. Capcom put some serious money behind the development and the marketing of this game, and the CGI cutscenes are absolutely breathtaking, giving us those Roger Rabbit vibes within the world of gaming. But then it was released, and depending on where you pre-ordered the game, you would get serious advantages to your character based on the game systems found in various collector's sets. Now the gem system, without going too in depth, gives your characters the ability to improve their fighting style, their speed, their defense and what have you, meaning that this was without a doubt the most unbalanced mess of a game released in Tekken's life up to this point. Along with hidden characters that were promoted on the lead up to the game's release only to be unlocked if you actually paid to unlock them via DLC, made this a truly unacceptable entry in the Tekken and Street Fighter universe. The game was also extremely unbalanced as stated, which was the real nail in the coffin for the title. Thankfully, Capcom did pull a 180 for the title, offering a free update that heavily fixed the game a year or so later, but by this point the fans had moved on. Namco had already put their version on hiatus, and since then they've cancelled it, and although it left a bad taste in the mouths of many at the time, if you do see it on the cheap, I actually do recommend that you pick it up. What you will play will 100% be more Street Fighter than Tekken, but that's a given. I really like what the game turned into, it's just a shame that the good version of this game came out so very, very late. Leaving one final game to talk about, and that is of course Tekken 7, at this point in time the most recent Tekken game to date. And boy golly gosh, was it a return to form for the series. Would you believe it? Fans just wanted a decent fighter. All of the elements added over the last several installments ended up taking away from that, whether you was a hardcore or a casual consumer. Someone was going to be getting upset and Tekken needed to win back the lot of them, which is exactly what they did. Sure, the game itself didn't exactly explode with extra little features like previous games, but it did what it set out to do. The core game itself was simply fun for all skill levels. Sidestepping has never felt so good, the free roaming of the third space is something you will all quickly take advantage of very early on in your Tekken journey. The rage is now cleaned up with rage specific moves, you got those cinematic burnout like slowdown sections which surprisingly do not get in the way of the gameplay. You have an absurd amount of customizations and the unlockable cutscenes from the previous games that really do make a long-time fan of the series like me stupidly happy are all present here. Sadly, the story itself is a little lackluster with this title, and for me, the payoff of completing the game with each character is terribly mundane. It's something that forced me to play with extra characters in the previous games, but now I'll just stick with who I'm good at. A lot of the extra features that the fans wanted did eventually get added in the form of DLC, sadly. But besides its flaws, it truly was the definitive Tekken game that fans wanted and the hardcore scene craved, bringing back its rightful place as the technical man's fighting game. Find the right opponent and you quite literally have an infinite amount of gameplay with this title. And there you have it guys, the complete history of Tekken, one of the simplest 3D fighting games turned into the most complicated 3D fighting game for those that are willing to sell their entire game collection and only focus on this one series. Or you could be more like me, the average consumer that just enjoys it for what it is, one of the most fun and accessible fighting games ever to grace home consoles, a fighting game series that helped define the new kid on the block PlayStation, which of course would become a mainstay going up against the mighty Sega and Nintendo. A series that, like many others, has had its fair share of missteps, but at the same time it has stood the test of time with its standout titles. Tekken 7 is that standout title, and it is the build up to everything we've been playing since about Tekken 3, and although it's very unlikely to be the end for the franchise, for me it is the perfect way to round up this complete history. Hey there guys, thank you for checking out the video. This one was a long one, I've been working on it for a very long time, but you know, I'm always rewarded the most when I create these massive complete histories and I'm able to really put the time and effort in. So yeah, thank you guys if you did make it this far into the video. And of course, as it is this part of the video, I'd like to give a massive shout out to all of the Patrons and YouTube members that actually allow me to create these videos. So thank you to every single one of you, and I hope you've had a great holiday and a great new year. I've got plenty of yeah, even bigger Complete Histories coming next year, thinking about it, some of the ones I've got planned, and some big kick scammers as well. So thank you to all of you guys, with an extra big shout out going to at BitGamer88, Aaron Gorman, Agro Crag, Andrew Dalton, Arista, Benjamin Guy, Big Rico, Bram Perez, Cheshire One, Chris the Shapeshifter, Chris Walker, Christopher DeVero, Clan Bob, Conrad Constantine, Action Saxon, Dalton, aka Chef Matic, Daniel Tarares, Dina81, Diggsy B, Game Apologist, Gary Pingett, Ian Quell, Intrigued Gaming, Jay is Manchild, Jabba Al Aiden, James, Jeff Mianowski, Jeremy Rodriguez, Josh Gibbons, Kinglink Reviews, Lucas Softail, Luke Jorgensen, Man of God 9000, Man Shovel, Matt Jackson, Michael Ridley Dash, Mike Fallon, Mind of the Unsane, Nicholas Burtner, Nick Pollard, Over Giles Zane, Pretendo64, Roll VP, Ray Blair, Retro to Next Gen, aka Lou, Richard Alderjic, Rovan Army, Ryan Holt, Sabrina, Stott, Samuel Nilsson, Shade Silence, Shadow Dragon, Solix Captor, Stephen, Taylor Rainwater, That Gamer, The Cunning Linguist, Tim Labonte, Tim Lund, Todd Paul Float G, Vitas Varnes, Vike Echo, Wobbles and Bean, The Wonder Ducks, and Ye Old Hamburglar. Like I said, everybody that you see here all deserve massive props for supporting this channel this year. Thank you guys so much for all your support, and if you guys want to jump in on this, there'll be links down in the description so you can become a YouTube member or a patron and get to see all of these videos before they go early. I have some incredible perks as I revamp the whole thing for the beginning of next year. Regardless, thank you guys so much for your support. Hope you have a great holiday, guys, and until next time, this is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.